Emma Vaughn stood in the center of Wallace, Idaho's only mercantile, her voice carrying clear and strong as she addressed the room full of startled townsfolk. "I am telling you that women deserve the right to own property in their own names, and any man who disagrees is simply afraid his wife might prove more capable than he is." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the nervous shuffling of feet and the whispered scandalization of the three older women near the fabric bolts. It was April of 1883, and Emma had just sealed her fate as the most unmarriageable woman in Silver Valley. The mercantile owner, Mr. Patterson, cleared his throat awkwardly and returned to weighing out flour for Mrs. Henderson, who clutched her reticule as though Emma's words might somehow contaminate her through proximity. Emma felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest, but held her head high as she completed her own purchases, counting out coins for thread, sugar, and lamp oil. "Miss Vaughn, you really must learn to temper your tongue, Mrs. Henderson said in a tone that suggested she was performing a charitable service. "No man wants a wife who argues with him at every turn." Emma turned to face the older woman fully, her green eyes flashing. "Then perhaps I should be grateful for my unmarried state, as it appears to be the only honest one available to me. I would rather speak my mind and remain alone than bite my tongue and live a lie." The bell above the door chimed as Emma departed, her basket over her arm and her spine straight despite the burning in her throat that threatened tears. She would not cry. She had not cried in the 6 months since her father died and left her the small ranch at the edge of town. And she would not cry now over the small minds of small people who could not imagine a woman having thoughts worth expressing. Wallace was a mining town at its heart, nestled in the mountains of northern Idaho where silver had been discovered just a few years prior. The population had swelled with prospectors, businessmen, and those who serviced both, but the social structure remained rigidly traditional. Women were expected to be demure, obedient, and above all, quiet about matters of business, politics, or anything else deemed masculine territory. Emma's father, Thomas Vaughn, had raised her differently. A widower since Emma was 8 years old, he had possessed neither the skill nor the inclination to mold his daughter into a silent ornament. Instead, he had taught her to read beyond simple primers, to calculate figures for ranch management, to think critically about the world around her. He had discussed politics with her over dinner, asked her opinions on livestock purchases, and treated her as an intelligent human being rather than a decorative possession awaiting transfer to a husband's keeping. His death from pneumonia the previous October had left Emma devastated and, according to Wallace society, in a precarious position. At 22 years old, she was past the age when most women married, and her reputation for outspokenness had not endeared her to potential suitors. The ranch, though small, was valuable, and several men had approached her with offers that were transparently more about acquiring her land than acquiring her partnership. Emma had refused them all, much to the horror of the town's matrons who believed a woman alone was both pitiable and vaguely scandalous. She had managed the ranch through winter with the help of Samuel, the aging ranch hand who had worked for her father for 15 years. But Samuel's rheumatism was worsening, and Emma knew she would need additional help come spring roundup. The walk back to the ranch took 30 minutes at a steady pace, following the rutted road that wound through stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. The April air was crisp and carried the scent of snowmelt and fresh growth, and despite the unpleasantness in town, Emma felt her spirits lift as she always did when returning home. The ranch house was modest but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a main room that served as kitchen and parlor, and a covered porch that faced the mountains to the east. Her father had built it with his own hands, and every beam and board held his memory. Samuel was mending fence near the barn when she arrived, his weathered face creasing into a smile as he spotted her. "How was town, Miss Emma?" "The same as always, Samuel. I managed to offend the delicate sensibilities of half the mercantile simply by existing." She set her basket on the porch and came to inspect his work. "How is your hand today?" "Stiff but working," he said, flexing his gnarled fingers. "Miss Emma, I have to be honest with you. I do not think I can manage the spring work the way I used to. We need to hire on some help, at least for a few months." Emma had known this conversation was coming, but the reality of it still settled heavy in her stomach. "I know, Samuel. I have been thinking the same thing. I will ride into town tomorrow and post a notice at the saloon." "There is a better way," Samuel said, his tone careful. "I heard in town last week that Frank Garrett is back in the area. He is a good man, honest worker, and I knew him years ago when he was just starting out. If he is looking for work, you could not find better." Emma frowned. "I have never heard you mention him before." "He has been up in Montana these past years, working the big cattle drives, but his mother was from Wallace, and I heard she passed last month. He came back to settle her affairs." Samuel paused in his work to look at her directly. "He is not like the other men around here, Miss Emma. He does not suffer fools, and he respects honest work, no matter who is doing it." It was the closest Samuel had ever come to referencing Emma's difficulties with the men of Wallace, and she appreciated his discretion. "Where might I find him?" "He is staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street, the one Mrs. Kowalski runs." "But Miss Emma," Samuel's voice took on a warning note, "you should know that Frank Garrett speaks his mind as plainly as you do. Some folks find it refreshing. Others find it offensive." Emma could not help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Then perhaps we will understand each other." The next morning dawned clear and cold, and Emma dressed with care in her riding skirt and a shirt-waist that was practical rather than fashionable. She braided her dark hair and pinned it in a coronet around her head, then added her father's old coat for warmth. The ride into Wallace took 20 minutes on her mare, Gypsy, and she arrived at Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house just after 8 o'clock. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that had been painted yellow at some point in the distant past, though weather had faded it to the color of old butter. Emma tied Gypsy to the hitching post and climbed the front steps, where Mrs. Kowalski herself answered her knock. "Miss Vaughn, what brings you here so early?" The older woman's eyes were bright with curiosity, already calculating what gossip this visit might yield. "Good morning, Mrs. Kowalski. I am looking for Frank Garrett." "I understand he is boarding with you, and I have a business matter to discuss with him." Mrs. Kowalski's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "A business matter? My dear, it is hardly proper for a young woman to be seeking out a single man, even for business." Emma felt the familiar frustration rising but kept her voice level. "Fortunately, the management of my ranch and the hiring of my staff fall within my purview as the landowner. Is Mr. Garrett available?" Before Mrs. Kowalski could formulate a response that was sure to be both judgmental and unhelpful, a male voice spoke from somewhere inside the house. "I am here, Mrs. Kowalski. I will speak with Miss Vaughn." A man appeared in the doorway behind the landlady, and Emma found herself looking up at someone who immediately commanded attention without seeming to try. Frank Garrett stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His hair was dark brown and slightly too long, and his face was tanned and angular with lines around his eyes that suggested he spent more time squinting into the sun than sitting in parlors. But it was his eyes that struck Emma most, a clear gray that regarded her with direct intelligence and no trace of the condescension she had grown accustomed to from men. "Mr. Garrett, I am Emma Vaughn. Samuel Cooper suggested I speak with you about employment. Might we talk privately, Mrs.?" Kowalski made a sound of protest, but Frank was already reaching for the coat that hung by the door. "We can talk on the porch, Miss Vaughn. Mrs. Kowalski, I will be back for breakfast shortly." He stepped out and closed the door firmly behind him, leaving the landlady inside, and gestured for Emma to precede him down the steps. They walked a short distance from the house, and Emma was aware of curtains twitching in windows up and down the street. Let them look, she thought. She had stopped caring about Wallace's gossip months ago. "Samuel speaks highly of you," Frank said without preamble. "He says you are running the Vaughn place on your own since your father passed." "That is correct. I need a ranch hand for the season, possibly longer depending on how things work out. Samuel is still with me, but his hands are not what they used to be. The work is standard for a small ranch, cattle and horses primarily, some crop management, fence repair, that sort of thing. I pay fair wages, provide meals, and there is a small cabin on the property that serves as the ranch hand quarters." Emma delivered this speech with the same straightforward manner she would use with any business negotiation, watching Frank's face for his reaction. He nodded slowly, his gray eyes thoughtful. "What happened to your last ranch hand? Samuel mentioned there was someone helping out last season." "John Mitchell worked for us for 3 years. He left last fall to get married and start his own homestead up near Mullen. It was an amicable parting." Emma paused, then decided honesty was the best approach. "I should tell you that some men in Wallace find me difficult to work with because I involve myself in all aspects of the ranch management. I do not simply hire someone to run things while I sit in the house doing needlework. If that will be a problem for you, we should establish that now." Frank's expression did not change, but something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Miss Vaughn, I have worked for plenty of men who knew less about ranching than their horses did. If you know what you are doing and treat people fairly, I do not care whether you wear skirts or trousers. What I care about is honest work for honest pay and being treated with respect. Can you offer that?" Emma felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had not fully realized she was carrying. "Yes, Mr. Garrett, I can offer that." "Then I accept your offer. When do you want me to start? Is tomorrow too soon?" "Tomorrow is fine. I will come out to the ranch in the morning." Frank extended his hand, and after a moment's surprise, Emma shook it. His grip was firm but not crushing, his hand calloused from years of rope and rain. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. I will see you tomorrow then." Emma turned back toward where Gypsy waited, then paused. "Samuel was right about you." "What did Samuel say?" "That you speak your mind plainly. Some people find it refreshing." She allowed herself a small smile. "I am among them." Frank's answering smile transformed his serious face, reaching his eyes with genuine warmth. "Then I think we will get along just fine, Miss Vaughn." Emma rode back to the ranch feeling lighter than she had in months. She told herself it was simply relief at having found capable help, that the small flutter in her stomach when Frank smiled was merely surprise at being treated as a reasonable human being rather than a problematic woman. But as she unsaddled Gypsy and rubbed the mare down, she found her thoughts returning to gray eyes and a direct manner that reminded her of her father's approach to the world. Samuel was splitting firewood when she found him, and he looked up expectantly. "Well, he starts tomorrow." "You were right about him, Samuel. I think it will work out well." The older man's face creased into a satisfied smile. "I am glad to hear it, Miss Emma. Frank Garrett is a good man. His father was a drunk, and his mother worked herself to the bone keeping food on the table. but Frank turned out honest despite it all. He has been on his own since he was 16, and everything he knows, he learned through hard work. That night, Emma lay in her narrow bed and listened to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through the pines. She thought about the morning, about the conversation on Mrs. Kowalski's porch, about the way Frank had looked at her as though she were simply another person rather than a woman who needed managing. It had been so long since anyone besides Samuel had treated her that way that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. She thought, too, about what tomorrow would bring, the beginning of the season's work that would make or break the ranch's survival. Her father had left her with a modest herd, 40 head of cattle and a dozen horses, but she needed to increase those numbers if she was going to maintain the property long term. The land itself was good, 160 acres of grassland and forest with a creek running through the eastern section, but land without the means to work it was worthless. Frank Garrett arrived at 7 the next morning, riding a rangy buckskin gelding and leading a pack horse with his belongings. Emma was already up and had coffee boiling on the stove, bacon frying in the skillet. She met him at the barn where Samuel was waiting to show him around. "Morning, Miss Vaughn," Frank said, swinging down from the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it. "Good morning, Mr. Garrett. Come inside when you are settled. Breakfast is almost ready." She returned to the house and set 3 plates on the table, adding biscuits from yesterday's baking and the bacon to the waiting plates. It felt strange to be cooking for someone new, but it was a good strange, a return to the way things had been when her father was alive, and the house felt full rather than empty. The 2 men came in a few minutes later, Samuel making introductions that were not really necessary. "Frank, this is Miss Emma Vaughn, Miss Emma Frank Garrett. We have met," Emma said with a slight smile, gesturing to the table. "Please sit. We can discuss the work over breakfast." Frank removed his hat and took the seat she indicated, his movements economical and sure. Emma poured coffee for all 3 of them and took her own seat at the head of the table, her father's place. And if either man found that unusual, neither commented over the meal. They discussed the immediate tasks at hand. The cattle needed to be moved to higher pasture. Several sections of fence required repair, and the barn roof had developed a leak over the winter that needed addressing before the spring rains began in earnest. Emma had a list of priorities, organized by urgency and available resources, and she laid it out clearly while the men listened. "I am impressed," Frank said when she finished. "You have thought this through thoroughly." "My father taught me that successful ranching is 90% planning and 10% adapting when the plan goes wrong," Emma replied. "I have been managing the books for this place since I was 16. I know every head of livestock, every debt, every asset." "Then you know more than most ranchers I have worked for," Frank said, and there was no hint of condescension in his voice, only statement of fact. Samuel pushed back from the table with a satisfied sigh. "Miss Emma, if you do not mind, I will start on that fence today. My hands are better in the morning." "Of course, Samuel. Thank you." Emma turned to Frank. "I thought I would show you the property today, give you a sense of the full scope of the operation. Tomorrow we can start on the barn roof." They spent the morning riding the boundaries of the ranch, Emma pointing out landmarks and explaining her plans for expansion. Frank listened more than he spoke, but when he did offer comments, they were insightful and showed a deep understanding of land management. He asked about water sources, grass quality, predator problems, all the practical concerns of someone who genuinely cared about doing the job right. As they paused on a rise that overlooked the eastern section of the property, Frank said, "This is good land, Miss Vaughn. Your father chose well. He did. He used to bring me up here when I was young and tell me that land was the only thing that lasted, that we were just temporary keepers of something bigger than ourselves. Emma felt the familiar ache of loss, but also the warmth of good memories. He wanted this place to thrive beyond his own lifetime. Then we will make sure it does, Frank said simply, and Emma believed him. They rode back to the house for the midday meal, and Emma found herself relaxing in Frank's company in a way she had not expected. He did not fill silences with empty chatter, but when he did speak, his words had weight and thought behind them. More than that, he listened to her with the same attention he would give to anyone, neither dismissing her thoughts because of her gender nor patronizing her with false agreement. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself that felt both foreign and natural. Emma, Samuel, and Frank worked the ranch together, each contributing according to their abilities. Samuel handled the smaller tasks and managed the kitchen garden that provided vegetables for the table. Frank took on the heavy labor of fence repair, barn maintenance, and cattle management. Emma oversaw everything, working alongside Frank on most tasks and managing the business side of the operation in the evenings. The weather warmed as April gave way to May, and the mountain meadows exploded with wildflowers. Emma found herself watching Frank more than was strictly professional, noticing the way he moved with unconscious grace, the way he spoke gently to the horses, the way his rare smiles transformed his serious face. She told herself it was simply appreciation for a job well done, but she knew she was lying. One evening in mid-May, as the sun was setting in shades of gold and crimson behind the western peaks, Emma and Frank were working together to repair a section of corral fence. Samuel had already retired to his cabin, and the two of them worked in the comfortable silence that had developed between them. "Miss Vaughn," Frank said suddenly, "may I ask you a personal question?" Emma looked up from the post she was bracing while he hammered. "You may ask." "I reserve the right not to answer." His mouth quirked in that almost smile. "Fair enough. Why have you never married? I have been in Wallace long enough now to hear the gossip, and I know plenty of men have asked. You are attractive, intelligent, and you have property. By all conventional standards, you should have had your pick." Emma was surprised by the question, but also oddly pleased that he felt comfortable enough to ask it. She considered her answer while he finished hammering the nail, then spoke carefully. "Because every man who asked wanted me to become someone else. They wanted me to stop thinking, stop planning, stop being involved in the work of the ranch. They wanted me to hand everything over to their management and content myself with cooking and sewing and having babies. I could not do that. I could not make myself smaller to fit into someone else's idea of what I should be." Frank set down the hammer and looked at her directly. "Their loss, perhaps, or perhaps I am genuinely unsuited for marriage. Perhaps I am too opinionated, too independent, too difficult." Emma heard the bitterness in her own voice and hated it, but the words came anyway. "The women in Wallace certainly think so. The women in Wallace are fools, then." Frank spoke with such matter-of-fact conviction that Emma almost laughed. "Miss Vaughn, can I tell you something, please? I have worked for a lot of people in my 30 years. Rich ranchers, poor homesteaders, men who inherited everything they had, and men who built from nothing. The best partnerships I have seen, whether in business or marriage, have been between people who respected each other enough to listen and disagree and still work together. Every failed operation I have witnessed failed because one person thought they knew everything and refused to hear anyone else." He picked up a new post and set it in place, and Emma automatically moved to brace it without being asked, their movements coordinated through weeks of working together. "I have never wanted a quiet woman," Frank continued. I have never wanted someone who just nods and agrees with everything I say. That is not a partner. That is a possession, and I do not want to possess anyone. Emma's heart was beating faster than the physical exertion warranted. What do you want, Mr. Garrett? Frank drove the first nail with 3 sure strikes of the hammer before he answered. I want a partner who speaks her mind, someone who will tell me when I am wrong and listen when I am right, someone who sees the world clearly and is not afraid to say what she sees. He drove another nail, then looked up at her, his gray eyes holding hers. Someone like you, Miss Vaughn. The words hung in the air between them, and Emma felt as though the world had shifted slightly on its axis. Frank, she said, using his given name for the first time, are you saying what I think you are saying? I am saying that I have spent the last 6 weeks working alongside the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I would like permission to court her properly, if she is interested. His voice remained steady, but Emma could see the tension in his shoulders, the vulnerability in being the one to speak first. She thought about all the reasons she should say no. They had known each other only a short time. He worked for her, which complicated matters. The town would have opinions, most of them negative. But against all of that, she weighed the feeling of rightness she experienced when they worked together, the way he made her laugh with his dry observations, the respect he showed her every single day in word and deed. I am interested, Emma said quietly. Very interested. Frank's smile was like sunrise, slow and warming everything it touched. Then perhaps we could start by having dinner together tomorrow evening, just the 2 of us. I notice there is a spot by the creek that would be right pleasant with a blanket and some food. I would like that very much. They finished the fence repair as the last light faded from the sky, and when they walked back to the barn together, their hands brushed and then clasped, fingers intertwining. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, a crossing of a threshold that could not be uncrossed. Emma lay awake long into the night, her mind racing with possibilities and fears, and a fragile, growing hope that she barely dared acknowledge. She had spent so long believing that her choices were between silence and solitude, between becoming someone else or being alone. The possibility that she might find someone who valued her exactly as she was seemed almost too good to be true. But Frank had proven himself honest in every dealing, and she chose to believe his words now. The next day dragged interminably, despite being full of work. Emma found herself distracted, burning the biscuits at breakfast and nearly forgetting to latch the chicken coop. Samuel noticed, his weathered face crinkling with amusement, but he said nothing beyond a knowing look that made Emma blush. Frank was equally distracted, measuring a board 3 times and still cutting it wrong, but he laughed at himself rather than cursing, and Emma loved that about him, the ability to find humor in imperfection. When evening finally came, Emma changed into her better dress, a soft green cotton that her father had bought her 2 years ago for her birthday. She left her hair down, held back from her face with combs, and allowed herself to feel feminine in a way she usually avoided, because it made her feel vulnerable. Frank met her at the house with a basket over his arm and an expression that told her he was just as nervous as she was. "You look beautiful," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." They walked together to the spot he had mentioned, where the creek widened into a small pool and willows provided a curtain of privacy from the main house. Frank spread a blanket and unpacked the basket, revealing bread, cheese, cold chicken, and a jar of preserved peaches. "Mrs. Kowalski packed this for me," he admitted. "I think she suspects something, but she is a romantic underneath all that propriety." Emma laughed as she settled onto the blanket. "Mrs. Kowalski will have us married by morning if gossip were truth." Would that be so terrible? Frank asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Careful, Mr. Garrett. We have not even had our first proper meal together and you are already proposing. But Emma was smiling as she said it, and she saw Frank relax slightly. They ate as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing. Frank told her about his years in Montana, the long cattle drives and harsh winters, the characters he had met and places he had seen. Emma shared stories about her childhood, her father's patient teaching, her mother's death that she barely remembered but still shaped her in ways she was only beginning to understand. My father used to say that my mother would have loved my spirit, Emma said, lying back on the blanket to watch the first stars appearing. He said she was quiet, but it was a watchful quiet, not a submissive one. She saw everything and spoke when her words would matter most. Frank stretched out beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. You must miss him terribly. Every day. But I think he would be happy with how I am managing the ranch. I think he would be happy that I did not compromise myself just to meet social expectations. She turned her head to look at Frank. I think he would like you. I hope so. I would have liked to meet him. Frank reached over and took her hand, their fingers lacing together naturally. Emma, I want you to know that I am serious about this, about us. I am not a man who plays at emotions or toys with people. When I commit to something, I see it through. I know. I can tell that about you. Emma squeezed his hand. I am serious too, Frank. I have spent years believing that I would never find someone who wanted me as I am. I am still a little afraid that this is too good to be real. It is real. Frank raised himself on one elbow to look down at her, his face shadowed but his eyes catching starlight. I promise you, this is real. When he kissed her, it was gentle and questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, Emma reached up to cup his face with her free hand, answering his question with the press of her lips against his. The kiss deepened, and Emma felt as though she were falling and flying simultaneously, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. When they finally drew apart, both breathing harder than the kiss alone warranted, Frank rested his forehead against hers. I should probably take you back before Samuel comes looking for you with a shotgun. Emma laughed breathlessly. Samuel is the one who suggested I hire you in the first place. I think this was his plan all along. Then Samuel is a very wise man. They packed up the remains of the picnic and walked back to the house hand in hand, and when Frank kissed her again at the porch steps, Emma felt as though every difficult year, every lonely night, every moment of standing firm in her convictions had led to this, to him, to the possibility of a future that did not require her to diminish herself. Over the following weeks, their courtship continued in stolen moments between work. A brush of hands while passing tools, lingering glances across the dinner table, evening walks along the creek when the day's work was done. Samuel watched it all with grandfatherly approval, and if the town gossiped, Emma found she cared less and less. She was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way she had not known was possible. Frank made her laugh with his wry observations about the world. He listened to her opinions and offered his own, and they debated everything from politics to cattle breeding without either taking offense. He challenged her thinking when he disagreed, but respected her conclusions even when they differed from his own. And the physical attraction that had been present from the beginning only grew stronger. Emma found herself watching the play of muscles in Frank's arms as he worked, remembering the feel of his lips on hers, imagining more than was probably proper for an unmarried woman. But she was 22 years old, not a child, and Frank was 30, a grown man who looked at her with an intensity that made her feel beautiful and desired and whole. One evening in early June, as they sat together on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Frank said, "Emma, I need to tell you something." She heard the seriousness in his tone and turned to face him fully. "What is it?" "I have been saving money for years. Every dollar I could spare from the drives, I put away. I was planning to buy my own place eventually, to stop working for other people and build something of my own." He paused, his jaw working as he chose his words. "But I have realized recently that what I build does not matter nearly as much as who I build it with." Emma's heart was racing again, that becoming familiar sensation that accompanied significant moments with Frank. "What are you saying?" Frank took both her hands in his, holding them gently but firmly. "I am saying that I love you, Emma Vaughn. I love your sharp mind and your fierce independence and your kind heart. I love the way you laugh and the way you argue and the way you see the world clearly and without illusions. I love working beside you and talking with you and simply being in your presence." Tears were streaming down Emma's face now, but she was smiling so wide it almost hurt. "I love you too, Frank. I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes." "Marry me," Frank said, and it was not quite a question but not quite a command either. Something in between that acknowledged her right to choose while making his desires abundantly clear. "Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life being your partner in every sense of the word. Let me work beside you and sleep beside you and build a life that belongs to both of us equally." "Yes," Emma said through her tears. "Yes, absolutely yes." Frank pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that had been restrained in their previous embraces, and Emma responded in kind, her hands tangling in his hair, her body pressed against his. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard and Emma was fairly certain she was blushing to the roots of her hair. "We should probably wait until after the wedding for more of that," Frank said, his voice rough, "because I am barely holding on to my self-control as it is." Emma laughed and rested her head against his chest, hearing the rapid beat of his heart that matched her own. "How long should we wait? For the wedding, I mean." "I would marry you tomorrow if we could arrange it," Frank admitted, "but I suppose we should do it properly. Post the banns, give people time to prepare. Late June, perhaps? 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks sounds perfect. We can have the ceremony at the church in Wallace and hold a reception here at the ranch." Emma was already planning in her head, the practical side of her nature asserting itself even in the midst of emotional upheaval. "It will be simple. I do not need elaborate decorations or a fancy dress, just our friends and a good meal." "Just you, me, and our promises," Frank agreed. "That is all that matters." They told Samuel the next morning over breakfast, and the old ranch hand's face creased into the biggest smile Emma had ever seen. "Well, it is about time," he said, pulling Emma into a hug. "I thought you two were going to dance around each other all summer. You knew?" Emma asked, though she was not really surprised. "Miss Emma, I may be old, but I am not blind. Frank has been looking at you like you hung the moon since about the second week he was here, and you have been just as bad. I am just glad you both finally said something." Frank clapped Samuel on the shoulder. "I have you to thank for this, old friend. If you had not suggested Emma hire me, none of this would have happened." "I knew what I was doing," Samuel said with satisfaction. "Now, when is the wedding? I need to get my good suit cleaned." The news spread through Wallace faster than a wildfire in dry grass. Emma made the announcement when she went to town for supplies, posting the banns at the church and informing the minister of their intentions. Reactions were mixed, as she had expected. Some people were genuinely happy for her, particularly those who had known her father and understood Emma's independent nature. Others were scandalized that she was marrying her ranch hand, seeing it as marrying beneath herself despite Frank's obvious competence and character. Mrs. Henderson, predictably, had opinions. "My dear Miss Vaughn, are you quite certain about this? Mr. Garrett seems a rough sort of man, and marriage is such a permanent arrangement." "I am absolutely certain, Mrs. Henderson. Frank is the finest man I have ever known, and I count myself extraordinarily fortunate that he wants to marry me." Emma kept her voice pleasant but firm, offering no room for argument. "But what will happen to your ranch? Surely you will turn the management over to your husband now." "Frank and I will manage it together, as partners." Emma met the older woman's disapproving gaze directly. "We have discussed everything and are in complete agreement about how we want to run our lives." "Well," Mrs. Henderson sniffed, "I suppose you have always been a headstrong girl. I simply hope you do not come to regret your choices." Emma left the mercantile feeling irritated but not diminished. She had spent too long caring what Wallace thought of her, and she was done with that particular burden. Frank loved her and respected her, and that was worth more than the approval of every gossip in Idaho. The 3 weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of work and preparation. Emma sewed herself a new dress, cream-colored cotton with small blue flowers, simple but pretty. Frank bought a new suit in town, dark gray, that made his eyes look like storm clouds. Samuel cleaned and organized the barn for the reception, and several of their neighbors who had remained friendly offered to bring food and help with the celebration. The night before the wedding, Emma sat on the porch long after dark, too excited and nervous to sleep. She heard footsteps and turned to see Frank approaching from his cabin, his white shirt ghostly in the starlight. "Could not sleep either?" he asked, settling beside her on the step. "Too much going through my mind. Wondering if I remembered everything, if the weather will cooperate, if I will trip over my own feet walking down the aisle." Emma leaned against his shoulder. "Wondering if I am dreaming and will wake up to discover none of this is real." Frank wrapped his arm around her and kissed the top of her head. "It is real, Emma. Tomorrow you will become my wife and I will become your husband, and we will start building our life together. All the rest is just details. Have I told you lately that I love you? Not in at least 3 hours." "I was starting to wonder." Emma laughed and tilted her face up to kiss him. "I love you, Frank Garrett. I love you with everything I am. And I love you, Emma Vaughn. Soon to be Emma Garrett if you want to take my name, or you can keep yours, or we can figure out something else entirely. I do not care as long as I get to keep you." "Emma Garrett," she said, testing the sound of it. "I like that, though I will keep using Vaughn for business matters if that is acceptable. I have built a reputation under that name, and I do not want to confuse our customers." "Whatever you want, love. This is our marriage, and we get to define what it looks like." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, until Emma finally admitted she should try to sleep. Frank walked her to the door and kissed her one last time, gentle and sweet and full of promise. "Until tomorrow, my almost wife. Until tomorrow, my almost husband." Emma did eventually sleep, though fitfully, and woke before dawn with her heart pounding and butterflies rioting in her stomach. This was her wedding day, the day everything changed and nothing changed simultaneously. She would still be herself, still be Emma, but she would also be Frank's wife, part of a partnership that felt bigger and more important than anything she had attempted before. She dressed carefully in her new dress, pinned her hair up in a style that was elegant but not overly fussy, and looked at herself in the small mirror. Her mother's face looked back at her, or at least what she remembered of it from faded photographs. She hoped her mother would have approved. She hoped her father was somehow watching and knew that she had found what he had always wanted for her, someone who saw her value and cherished it. Samuel drove her to town in the wagon, dressed in his clean suit and looking nervous himself. "You look beautiful, Miss Emma." Your father would be so proud. Thank you, Samuel, for everything. Not just today, but for staying with me after Papa died, for helping me keep the ranch running, for introducing me to Frank. Emma felt tears threatening and blinked them back. You have been like family to me. You are family to me, Samuel said gruffly. Now let us get you to that church before that cowboy of yours decides you changed your mind. The church was small but full when they arrived, and Emma was surprised to see how many people had come. Not just the obligatory social appearances of Wallace society, but genuine well-wishers who smiled at her with real warmth. She saw several of the neighboring ranchers who had respected her father and apparently transferred that respect to her. She saw Mrs. Kowalski from the boarding house, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She even saw a few of the working girls from the saloon, who had always treated Emma with kindness, despite the social gulf that was supposed to separate them. And at the front of the church, standing beside the minister, was Frank. He had shaved carefully and his hair was neatly trimmed, and he wore the new gray suit with the same unconscious grace he brought to everything. But it was his face that arrested Emma, the expression of pure love and joy and perhaps a touch of awestruck wonder, as though he could not quite believe his good fortune. Emma walked down the aisle with Samuel, her hand tucked into his arm, her eyes locked on Frank. When they reached the front, and the minister asked who gave this woman in marriage, Samuel said, "She gives herself, as is her right, but I stand with her as family and friend." The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They spoke the traditional vows, and Emma's voice rang clear and strong when she promised to love and honor Frank for the rest of her days. Frank's voice was equally steady, his gray eyes never leaving hers as he pledged himself to her. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Frank kissed her, the small church erupted in applause and cheers that were decidedly unchurch-like but absolutely perfect. They rode back to the ranch together in the wagon, Emma tucked against Frank's side, both of them grinning like fools. The reception was a joyful chaos of food and music and dancing, with several people bringing fiddles and guitars. Emma danced with Frank, with Samuel, with several of the neighbors. Frank danced with Emma, with Mrs. Kowalski, with surprising grace for such a large man. As the sun began to set, and people started to drift away, Samuel quietly disappeared to his cabin, giving the newlyweds privacy in the house. Emma found herself suddenly nervous again, standing in the main room of the home that was now theirs together, watching Frank lock the door and turn to her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Hello, wife," he said softly. "Hello, husband," Emma replied. And then Frank crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that had been restrained throughout their courtship, but was finally, blessedly unleashed. They barely made it to the bedroom, leaving a trail of clothing behind them, and Emma discovered that physical intimacy with someone you loved, and who loved you in return, was nothing like the vague warnings and euphemisms that passed for education among women. It was beautiful and awkward, and intense and funny and utterly overwhelming in the best possible way. Frank was patient and passionate, attentive to her responses, and when it was over and they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Emma felt as though she had been fundamentally altered in some way she could not quite articulate. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Frank replied, his arms tightening around her. "So much, Emma, so very much." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Emma's last thought before consciousness faded was that she had never felt so safe, so valued, so completely herself. The early days of marriage were an adjustment, but a joyful one. Emma had to grow accustomed to sharing her space, her bed, her life in ways she never had before. Frank had to adjust to having a true partner rather than simply an employer. But they navigated it together, talking through issues as they arose, compromising when necessary, and always maintaining the respect for each other that had been the foundation of their relationship from the beginning. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Frank's experience combined with Emma's planning created a system that was efficient and productive. By the end of the summer, they had increased the herd by 15 head and sold several horses at good prices. Emma managed the books and correspondence while Frank handled most of the physical labor, though she still worked alongside him whenever possible because she genuinely enjoyed it. Samuel, released from the heaviest work but still involved in daily operations, seemed to grow younger rather than older, as though having a future to invest in gave him new energy. He taught Frank some of the tricks he had learned in his long years of ranching, and Frank taught Samuel some of the innovations he had seen in Montana. The three of them worked together like a well-oiled machine, each understanding their role but flexible enough to help wherever needed. That first winter as a married couple tested them in ways the warm months had not. Being snowed in together for days at a time, dealing with frozen water lines and cattle that needed constant attention, managing cabin fever and short tempers when the walls felt like they were closing in. But even in the difficult moments, Emma never doubted her choice. Frank might be grumpy when he came in from feeding cattle in a blizzard, but he never took it out on her. Emma might be frustrated by being cooped up inside, but Frank would make her laugh or distract her with passionate lovemaking that left them both exhausted and content. Spring came again, and with it, a discovery that filled Emma with equal parts joy and terror. She was pregnant. She told Frank one evening in late March, her hands trembling as she spoke the words that would change everything again. Frank's face went through a progression of expressions, surprise to wonder to fierce protectiveness to joy that eclipsed everything else. "A baby," he said, his voice hushed. "We are having a baby. Are you happy?" Emma asked, suddenly needing his reassurance despite the evidence of his reaction. "Happy?" Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of spun glass. "Emma, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and grateful, and 100 other things I do not have words for. We are going to be parents." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Emma struggled with nausea in the early months and physical limitations as she grew larger. She hated being unable to do her full share of work, but Frank and Samuel picked up the slack without complaint. Frank was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly checking on her, trying to prevent her from doing anything strenuous. Emma had to remind him repeatedly that she was pregnant, not fragile, and that women had been having babies while managing their lives since the beginning of time. "I know," Frank said, rubbing her swollen feet one evening while Emma sat in her father's old armchair. "I just worry. You are the most precious thing in the world to me, and I cannot stand the thought of anything happening to you." "Nothing is going to happen to me," Emma said with more confidence than she entirely felt. She knew the risks of childbirth, knew that women died from it with frightening regularity, but she refused to let fear dominate her experience. "I am strong and healthy, and we have the doctor in town if needed. Everything will be fine." And it was, though the labor was longer and more difficult than anyone had expected. Emma labored through a full day and night, with Frank beside her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, offering encouragement even as he looked increasingly panicked. The doctor came from town and offered what assistance he could, but ultimately it was Emma's body that did the work, pushing through pain and exhaustion to bring new life into the world. When the baby finally arrived in the gray light of dawn, crying lustily and waving tiny fists, the doctor announced, "You have a son, Mrs. Garrett." Emma wept from relief and joy as the doctor placed the baby in her arms, a squirming bundle wrapped in a clean towel. Frank knelt beside the bed, his face wet with tears, reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. "He is perfect," Frank said, his voice breaking. "Emma, you did it. You are amazing." "We did it," Emma corrected, exhausted but happy. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but now that the baby was real and present, the decision felt weightier. "What about Thomas?" Frank suggested. "After your father." Emma felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Thomas Garrett, I love it. Papa would have loved it." Little Thomas proved to be a healthy, hungry baby with a powerful set of lungs and his father's gray eyes. Frank was a devoted father, getting up for nighttime feedings, walking the floor with Thomas when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint. Emma watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again, seeing the gentleness and patience he brought to fatherhood. Samuel was equally besotted, declaring himself Thomas's honorary grandfather and spending hours rocking the baby and telling him stories about the ranch. "He is going to grow up knowing this land," Samuel said one afternoon, holding the sleeping infant. "He is going to know what it means to build something and care for it. You two are doing right by him." The first year of Thomas's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small milestones. First smile, first tooth, first words, first steps. The ranch continued to prosper, and Frank hired a young man named Peter to help with the work, someone who could take on the physical labor while Frank balanced his time between ranch work and helping Emma with the baby. On their second wedding anniversary, Frank gave Emma a gift that made her cry. It was a sign for the ranch, beautifully carved and painted, reading Vaughn and Garrett Ranch, established 1885. "It is our ranch," Frank said as Emma traced the letters with her fingers. "Yours and mine together." "I wanted the name to reflect that. We built this together, and whatever we build in the future will always be a partnership." Emma kissed him through her tears, overwhelmed by the gesture and what it represented. In a world that legally subsumed a woman's identity into her husband's upon marriage, Frank had gone out of his way to ensure Emma retained her name and her agency. The years that followed were full and rich, marked by hard work and deep satisfaction. They added to the herd, improved the property, and built a reputation for quality livestock that brought buyers from as far away as Spokane. Emma managed the business side with the same acumen her father had taught her, while Frank handled the livestock and land management. They made decisions together, sometimes disagreeing but always respecting each other's perspectives. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy who followed Frank around the ranch like a small shadow, learning about horses and cattle and the land that would someday be his responsibility. When he was 3, Emma became pregnant again, and this time she approached it with more confidence and less fear. Their daughter arrived in the early spring of 1888, and they named her Catherine after Frank's mother, a woman Emma had never met but who Frank spoke of with great love and respect. Catherine had her mother's dark hair and green eyes, and from the beginning, she demonstrated a strong will that made Emma laugh and sometimes despair. "She is just like you," Frank said one evening, watching 2-year-old Catherine stubbornly refuse to go to bed despite obvious exhaustion. "She is like both of us," Emma corrected. "Stubborn and determined and convinced she knows best. Heaven help us when she is older." But despite the challenges of raising 2 young children while managing a ranch, Emma would not have traded her life for anything. She had everything she had once thought impossible: a partner who valued her mind and her spirit, children she adored, work that fulfilled her, and a home that held her heart. One afternoon in the summer when Thomas was 5 and Catherine was 2, Emma stood on the porch watching her family. Frank was in the corral with Thomas, patiently teaching him to ride. Catherine was with Samuel in the garden, helping him weed, which mostly consisted of pulling up vegetables and offering them to the chickens. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold, and Emma felt her heart swell with gratitude so intense it was almost painful. Frank looked up and caught her watching, and his face transformed with that smile she loved so much. He said something to Thomas, then headed toward the house, leaving their son to continue practicing on his own. "What are you thinking about?" Frank asked as he climbed the porch steps and pulled Emma into his arms. "How happy I am. How perfect this moment is. How grateful I am that Samuel suggested I hire a certain cowboy 5 years ago." Emma rested her head against Frank's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Only 5 years. Feels like forever. Feels like no time at all." Frank kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Emma Garrett." "I love you too, Frank Garrett. More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." They stood there together, watching their children and the ranch they had built, and Emma knew that this was exactly where she was meant to be. She had spent years being told she was too opinionated, too independent, too difficult for marriage. And then she had met a man who said he wanted a partner who spoke her mind, and everything had changed. She had not changed herself to fit someone else's expectations. She had remained exactly who she was, and Frank had loved her not despite that but because of it. Their partnership was built on mutual respect, honest communication, and the understanding that a good marriage did not require either person to become smaller. As evening settled over the ranch and they called the children inside for supper, Emma reflected on how far she had come from that day in the mercantile when she had stood alone against the censure of the town. She was no longer alone. She had Frank, she had her children, she had Samuel, and she had the life she had built through determination and courage and refusing to compromise on what mattered most. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1890, and they buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, marking his grave with a stone that read "Friend and Family." Emma and Frank grieved the loss of the man who had been instrumental in bringing them together, but they also celebrated his life and the legacy he left behind. Thomas grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his parents did, and Catherine developed her mother's sharp mind and her father's dry wit. They added a third child to the family in 1891, another boy they named Samuel in honor of their friend, and he proved to be the easiest of their children, sweet, tempered, and content. The ranch prospered year after year, and Emma's business acumen combined with Frank's practical knowledge made them respected members of the ranching community throughout Idaho. People who had once dismissed Emma as too opinionated came to seek her advice on livestock and land management. Women who had pitied her unmarried state now envied her partnership with Frank, though few could imagine a marriage so different from their own. Through it all, Emma and Frank maintained the foundation they had built in those early days, treating each other as equals, speaking honestly, and working together through whatever challenges arose. They still disagreed sometimes, their debates as spirited as ever, but they always came back to respect and love. On their 10th anniversary, they hired help to watch the children and rode up to the spot by the creek where Frank had first kissed her. The willow trees had grown taller, and the meadow was full of summer wildflowers, and as they spread a blanket and lay together watching clouds drift across the blue sky, Emma felt the same sense of contentment she had experienced on their first evening together here. You ever regret it?" Frank asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean, taking on the life we have built. It has not always been easy." Emma turned to look at him, reaching over to cup his face with her hand. There was more gray in his hair now and lines around his eyes that had not been there when they met, but to her, he was as handsome as ever. "Not for one single moment," she said firmly. "Frank, you gave me something I thought I would never have. A partnership built on respect and love. A family. A life where I can be fully myself without apology. How could I ever regret that? I just want to make sure you are happy, that I am giving you what you need." "You are giving me everything I need," Emma said, leaning in to kiss him. "You gave me yourself, honest and true, and asked for nothing except that I be equally honest and true. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Frank pulled her close, and they lay together as the afternoon drifted into evening, talking and laughing, and simply being together in the way that long married couples can, comfortable in silence and companionship both. As the sun began to set and they gathered their things to return home, Frank said, "You know, I told myself when I came back to Idaho that I was just here to settle my mother's affairs and then move on. I had no plans to stay, no intention of putting down roots. What changed your mind?" Emma asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "You did. The moment Samuel mentioned you, described you as smart and capable and too opinionated for your own good, I was intrigued. And then I met you, and you looked at me like I was a person rather than a resource to be managed, and I was lost." Frank helped Emma onto her horse, then mounted his own. "Best decision I ever made, taking that job. Changed everything." They rode back toward the ranch house, visible in the distance with lamplight glowing warm in the windows. Their children would be waiting, probably driving the hired help to distraction. And there would be dinner to prepare and evening chores to complete, and 100 small tasks that made up their daily life. But Emma looked forward to all of it, every mundane moment, because it was the life she had chosen and built with the man she loved. Years later, when Thomas was preparing to take over full management of the ranch, and Catherine was teaching school in Wallace and young Samuel was still deciding what direction his life would take, Emma and Frank sat together on the porch they had repaired and expanded over the years. They were both in their 50s now, their hair gray and their hands marked by decades of hard work, but their love had only deepened with time. "You remember what you said to me that day we were fixing the corral fence?" Emma asked. "When you first told me how you felt." Frank smiled, the expression still capable of warming her from the inside out. "I said I wanted a partner who spoke her mind, someone who would tell me when I was wrong and listen when I was right, someone who saw the world clearly and was not afraid to say what she saw." "And you said you wanted someone like me," Emma finished softly. "I had spent so long believing that being myself meant being alone, and then you appeared and wanted exactly what I was." "I wanted you," Frank corrected. "Not some idealized version or some compromised version. Just you, Emma, exactly as you were. As you are." Emma leaned against his shoulder, his arm coming around her automatically, and they sat together watching the sun set over the mountains they had watched together for nearly 20 years. The ranch spread out before them, prosperous and beautiful, a testament to what two people could build when they worked together with respect and love. Thomas appeared from the barn, his own young son trailing behind him, already learning the same lessons Thomas had learned from Frank. Catherine rode up on her horse, home for a weekend visit, her laughter carrying across the yard as she dismounted. Samuel was in the house, helping with dinner preparations, whistling a tune Frank had taught him. This was their legacy, Emma thought. Not just the land and the livestock and the successful business, but the example they had set for their children. That love should be partnership, that marriage should be built on respect, that speaking your mind was not something to be ashamed of, but something to be valued. She had been considered too opinionated for marriage, and perhaps by the standards of Wallace society, she was. But Frank had never wanted her to be anything other than herself, and together they had built something that transcended those narrow expectations. As their children and grandchild gathered for the evening meal, the house filling with noise and laughter and love, Emma caught Frank's eye across the table and saw her own contentment reflected back at her. They had built this together, every moment of it, and it was more than she had ever dreamed possible. Years continued to add up, and eventually, Emma and Frank became the older generation, watching their children raise families of their own, seeing the ranch pass into Thomas's capable hands, watching Catherine raise her own daughters with the same fierce independence Emma had instilled in her. Samuel became a veterinarian, bringing modern medicine to the ranches of northern Idaho, and all three children remained close, bound by the example of love and partnership their parents had shown them. When Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, Emma grieved deeply, but without regret. They had 40 years together, 40 years of partnership and love and building something meaningful. She held his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped, and her last words to him were, "Thank you for everything, for seeing me, for loving me, for being exactly who you were." Emma lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, still sharp-minded and opinionated to the end. When she died at the age of 77, peacefully in the same house where she had been born, her family gathered around her, and her last thoughts were of Frank, of that first moment they met on Mrs. Kowalski's porch, of the life they had built together. They buried her next to Frank on the hill where Samuel rested, the three of them overlooking the ranch that had been the canvas for their shared life. The stone bore both her names, Emma Vaughn Garrett, honoring both the woman she had been and the partnership she had chosen. The ranch continued through the generations, the sign Frank had made still hanging at the entrance, Vaughn and Garrett Ranch, a reminder that the best things in life are built by people who respect each other enough to work together as equals. And in Wallace, Idaho, the story of Emma and Frank became the kind of legend that gets told and retold, changing slightly with each telling, but always keeping the heart of it intact. She was considered too opinionated for marriage, they would say, and most men were afraid of a woman who spoke her mind. But then came a cowboy who said he wanted a partner who spoke her mind, and together they built something that lasted beyond their own lifetimes. A love story that proved that the best partnerships are built on honesty, respect, and the courage to be exactly who you are. Their great-grandchildren still work the ranch, still tell the stories, still look at the old photographs of Emma and Frank, and see the love that shines through even in faded black and white. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the light slants golden across the meadows, those who know where to look say they can see two figures walking hand in hand by the creek, forever young, forever together, forever proving that true love is not about changing yourself to fit someone else's expectations, but about finding someone who wants you exactly as you are.